Glad now to introduce Shailen Popat.
Thank you very much. Before I begin my talk, I'd just like to take a minute to thank people. So, Simon and team, thank you very much for organising today, my first time here. What a wonderful centre. So great to know that we have centres like this, hidden away. And I think one of the results of today is that we can all promote these places, and I enjoyed having a brief walk around the museum and so on, and I got a better understanding of what you do. So thank you very much to all of you for that. Thank you for also putting it on YouTube and having videos afterwards. That is very, very important for people who can't be here and for us to all revisit and promote afterwards as well. Secondly, can I thank all the speakers that I've heard so far for stimulating so much interesting thought and discussion. And I won't take up too much time on each of them, but just I want to say a couple. With Rupert, he's left the room, I think, but I did speak with him at lunchtime because I was saying to him that as a PhD student, it's actually very important for us to have seasoned academics publish controversial things. Because if we want to follow in those footsteps, we do require people to publish in different ways so that we can then follow that or refer to that. Because for an early career researcher to do it is much more difficult, and for a research student could be nearly impossible. And David, it would be a great, well, you said you're going to retire, but I hope that doesn't mean that your thoughts and your production will be removed from the world. Otherwise, we may regard your retirement as also a contributory factor to climate change. Thank you very much for that. I attended a climate and apocalypse conference at the University of Warwick 2 years ago, where I was based then. And what came across to me, I was a member of the audience in that conference. It was an all-day conference as well. And there was no real thought from the East in that whole day. And so I resolved that day that the next time I got an opportunity, I would provide that voice. And so the aim of my talk today is to do that. I'm very pleased that members of the Hindu community of the Brahma Kumari tradition have accepted my invitation to come today. My mother had joined that very interesting group that looks very critically at Hinduism. So it's not something that, it's a group that doesn't accept anything per se. It chooses to question it very academically and systematically. So I actually spent a lot of my childhood in gatherings like this. And I think it did help my cognitive development growing up. So I'm really pleased that Rosemary brought me over from Oxford, Rachel's come from London, Sylvia, Carol who've come from Leicester, that you have been able to come today. Because I do think providing that Eastern thought into this wider discussion and networking is very important. So I'm going to say that together with interdisciplinary work, I would say that interfaith perspectives of this topic are very important. So now let me move on to the actual talk. I would like to talk about the Hindu cycle of time and look at these 4 areas of thoughts around the apocalypse, of potentiality, actuality, the apocalypse as being hostile to the status quo, and the apocalypse and fatality. So if I begin firstly just by referring to the image in front of you, which is going to be on every slide, so you cannot miss it. But this is the depiction of the Hindu concept of time. And I wanted to bring in, you'll see the red in that picture as the swastika image, which you may be familiar with. And this is going to be my attempt to claim it back from the corruption of the Nazis, and really present it to you in a way that it is used in India and in Indian homes, which is a very positive symbol. It's usually drawn in red, as that's regarded as an auspicious color, sometimes green, sometimes slightly a variation of that. And if you look at it in this context of the cycle of being of 4 ages, a golden age, a silver, a copper, and an iron. The Sanskrit terminology is Satyuga, which is literally an age of truth. Tretayug, which is an age of honor. Dwapuryug, which is an age of duality. And what Hindus would regard the current age as Kaliyug, which is the age of division and calamity. And then that whole cycle repeats round again. So Kaliyug moves into Satyug. And certainly in some traditions, the current phase that we're going through is regarded as the confluence, the meeting of these cycles. So Kaliyug meeting Satyug. And so within that context lies this concept of the apocalypse. So I wish to share on that theme. What I'm finding is that the term apocalypse, it's so grounded within Greek concepts and Judeo-Christian conversation that it's viewed and written about mainly with that backdrop and with those lenses. However, if apocalypse is viewed from with a different lens of time, we heard a talk earlier about the temporal aspect and how the temporal aspect frames a lot of perception. So then the perception of the apocalypse changes if the perception of time changes with it. Instead of time being a linear concept, if it is perceived as a circular concept, then the apocalypse is not something just of the future, but it is something that has happened and is something that will reoccur. And this is the main argument that I'm making. If one is to understand Hindu philosophy, I would say to you that the key word is eternity. Whether one looks at the concept of the soul, the Atman, the concept of God, the Paramatma, the concept of the elements of nature, the Panch Tattva, the concept is one that nothing is ever really created and nothing is ever really destroyed. You just get transformations of energy. And it's the transformation of energy that occurs over time that this cycle refers to. So I'm going to explore 4 concepts within this talk. Concept number 1, that the present is always pre-apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic. Concept number 2, fatality is not finality, as there is no finality. Concept number 3, human existence is a dramatic tragedy in the Greek sense. And a lot of my talk is going to be on that. And concept number 4, as you're familiar with and previous speakers have referred to it, that the apocalypse in this framework is a purification system. So the main points, potentiality. So the apocalypse is something which is potential, something of the future. And then, of course, a lot of the criticisms in the literature about potentiality is then you've got narratives of actuality, so the post-apocalyptic films and other depictions. So something that has already occurred, or something that will occur. And really, in this framing, it's both. It's always potential, and it's always actual. It's always a hostility to the status quo, because in this concept of time, if one puts time as central, as a central driver for life, then the status quo is always changing anyway. And so that status quo that is being challenged is always being challenged. But the apocalypse that the status quo is challenging is that status quo is always changing. So perceptions of the apocalypse also change with that. Because one is trying to move away from a different status quo, depending on where one is in history. And then one of the emotional reactions, of course, with the apocalypse is that apocalypse means fatality. When one frames it within eternity, there's no such thing as fatality. And so the apocalypse is not seen as such an enemy, although it has a certain amount of fatality of some aspects, but not comprehensive fatality. Concept number 1. The present is always pre-apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic. The process of destruction is never finalized. And this answers some of those that doubt in apocalypse with regards to the existence of survivors who report then the apocalyptic ordeal. So this solves that question, or perhaps ventures to solve that question. If one poses the question, I wonder what a post-apocalyptic world would look like. From the framing of this cycle, it would involve a marquee, a PowerPoint, lunch. So what I'm presenting to you is that congratulations. You're all post-apocalyptic survivors. So the post-apocalyptic world is not something which is not known, but something that is being lived and is known, and something that has been known. Because the whole series of the cycle is one which is going towards an apocalypse and then emerging from an apocalypse afterwards. In that sense, it's actually a narrative of hope, and it's also a narrative of promise, but it's also a narrative of continuity. Concepts of past and present alter considerably with this framework. Secondly, fatality is not finality, as there is no finality. And this is a quote from Mazurek, some of you may be familiar with. Only one thing is certain. It is the powerful and disruptive might which will change things on an unprecedented scale. To put things crudely, we do not know what is going to happen, but we do know that it will be devastating, irreversible, and last but definitely not least, unavoidable. As such, apocalypse constitutes the negative cultural project par excellence. Capable of disrupting everything, it offers nothing except the certainty of its own disruptive might. So the apocalypse, in the framing of the cycle, is this disruptive act, but it's also a catalyzing act. Because to shift radically from one age, one way of thinking and being and doing, to a completely different age and a completely different way of thinking and seeing and doing and being requires such a disruptive energy. And so the apocalypse is something which is necessary in this process of time revolving. So it's not something that is final, but something that is catalyzing. This concept of this process of time and of human existence as a dramatic tragedy. In the Poetics, Aristotle explains that the plot in a tragedy is more than just the story itself. It is the arrangement of the incidents or chain reaction of cause and effect events that happen in the story. So this cycle of time is not a random thing. It is seen as a causal chain, with the past creating the present creating the future, and then microcosms of that, where every thought then leads into the next, every word leads into the next, every action continually leading into the next. Aristotle also believed that the plot must have unity of action. So not only does each causal chain have its own connection, but that all causal chains within this bigger concept of time must have unity of action, where all of the events are dependent on the previous and lead to the next. We start with the incentive moment, or the moment that begins the cause and effect chain of events. Now, in a circle, the point of creation is always contested, it's always debated. So one could argue that the apocalypse is the moment of creation. One could use the lens that the book of Revelation meets the book of Genesis in that sense. Well, I read that upstairs. So this type of thing. One could argue these things. The reversal, sometimes called peripeteia, is a reversal of circumstances for the worse. And some of you may be familiar with Professor Sharot's excellent work of how our brain is geared towards being optimistic. And Matt Ridley, the Times columnist, he's written a book in 2012 called The Rational Optimist. And what Professor Sharot talks about is, and she's got a very excellent TED talk that you might want to visit if you haven't, is that we always think we're going to be okay, we'll get married, it'll be great, and our children will be geniuses, and we have this predisposition to optimism. And then we actually end up dealing with tragedies, because the reality can be quite different. And so policy, if we look at policy making throughout the ages, it's going to be great. And then the unintended consequences that come from that. And so this is why this human narrative of the tragedy. And then the climax, of course, is that highest point of action. So I'm arguing that this apocalyptic lens is really, what we're talking about, is a climax of action. However, does something happen after a climax? Well, recognition. Recognition is when the character makes an important discovery and gains insight into his life. The catastrophe marks the hero's ultimate suffering, which sometimes includes his own death. The resolution only comes when the other characters can mourn the loss of the hero, but then sees the good that has come with his passing. So rather than the fatalism of the apocalypse, it's actually something which is used to then build the next. Even though the hero suffers, in the end, he learns something about himself and his place in the world. Unfortunately, he sometimes dies after the discovery, and the play ends. And I've put in brackets, and begins again. And concept 4. And this is a quote from Berger. From the book of Revelation's condemnation of Babylon through the millenarian movements of the Middle Ages to more recent apocalyptic thinking, both religious and secular, visions of the end and its aftermath emphasize that no social reform can cure the world's diseases. Every structure of the old world is infected, and only an absolute purifying cataclysm can make possible an utterly new, perfected world. And so that very much fits within this narrative of shifting of ages. That when ages meet each other, and indeed when cycles meet each other, there is going to be this cataclysmic event. However, there is also then the narrative of the need to think about what happens after, because there is always an after. And perhaps that rescues the lifeboat metaphor that Rupert mentioned earlier, that actually there does need to be a lifeboat, because there will always be an after. Thank you.
Thank you, Shailen. Rupert, question.
Hi, Rupert.
Hi, yeah. Look, I'm totally in favour of us taking seriously Eastern thought, and I think that that's one of the things that gives us some hope at this point in history. But I do worry slightly that the way you're presenting it to us may give us a false sense of security. So here's a couple of key quotes from your talk. The process of destruction is never finalised. There is no finality. But it's not clear that we can be confident of that anymore. We need to consider things like Hansen's Venusian scenario as a possible way that climate change could manifest. And the Venusian scenario, if it occurs, would mean the end of life on Earth. That would be it. I mean, if that isn't a finality, then what is? I mean, you could say, look, it could be even worse. We could destroy the whole universe. But I don't feel a huge sense of relief that if we only manage to completely exterminate life on Earth. And so I'd feed back to you this remark of Wittgenstein's, which I think is very profound. He said, the truly apocalyptic view of history is that things do not repeat themselves. And I think we have to face that as a possibility.
Yeah, I think this is why it's so important to have this cultural exchange of ideas. Because, as I said, I do see this as a narrative of hope. So like some of the other speakers have said before, and I think people questioned you on this as well, that there is a positive narrative to things that are happening. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything that is leading to climate change and perhaps a climate change apocalypse is negative, because a lot of the science say, for example, I think you were saying that there's no such thing as, clean economic growth. Now, there is a reading of what you said, which is saying we shouldn't bother with developing clean technologies or developing technologies that can be good for after. And I suppose what this narrative says is that actually the challenges of climate change are also inspiring some really good inventions. And those good inventions need to make it aboard the lifeboat. And I think that's where this narrative is powerful.
Richard?
Hi, thank you for that. I found that really interesting. One of the things, because I suppose what you've presented here, because it's so elegant in its presentation of the design here of cyclicity, one of the things I was wondering about, and this follows on from what you're saying, that this is about dialogue, is how that kind of model might be dissonant with other kinds of model which it coexists with. I'm thinking in particular of the anthropologist Virtung's work in Sri Lanka, where he talks about the ways in which there were clashes between those who were advocating particular environmental reforms in Sri Lanka, and those who said, well, this is Kaliyug, this is to be expected, and then that becomes a way of resisting those kinds of changes. So I mean, given what you're saying, that you want to enter this into a dialogue, what kinds of dissonances do you find interesting, I suppose, between this model of rebirth and other ways of thinking about time?
Indeed, it's such an important question, because what I wanted to emphasize was the need for interdisciplinarity and interfaith, because what those multiple disciplines do, they bring the critical thinking. Hence my mention at the beginning of the Brahmakumari movement, and why I like it is it's a critical thought towards Hinduism. It's a critical perspective. So this model is not meant to be accepted, it's meant to be thought about. I'm in favor of a train of thought along the lines of, say, applied Hinduism. And when one is beginning to use philosophy and trying to apply it in any context, it takes that broader conversation that you are speaking of. One can take any concept and believe it blindly. But then when we begin to ask ourselves, does this really work? Is this really of benefit? And it's in that challenging of each other. It's in that questioning of each other that I would be hopeful we would actually find the real nectar of these concepts. what I wish to bring today is really that if the climate discourse is dominated by North America and Europe, which are steeped within Judeo-Christian traditions, then most of the world is not. So I've forgotten which speaker posed this problem about communication. It might have been the last speaker. This issue of communicating the climate change narrative. Is it because we've not actually listened to that multiplicity of beliefs? So if someone is saying that they're a fatalist, whatever's going to happen, to happen, do we need to actually listen to why they're saying that? What are the thought processes? And then learn a new way of communicating so that perhaps they begin to adopt a new way of thinking.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and particularly helpful to think of apocalyptic thinking in terms of a cyclical worldview. So it's very helpful. I just got a very minor sort of observation. Whilst I'm sure it's important to talk about East and West and Judeo-Christian and such like, obviously the kind of cyclical apocalyptic thinking is something very much in Western culture too. So in the kind of Stoic thought, this idea of ekpyrosis and this regular conflagration leading to purification and rebirth of the universe is something that's there too. So whilst I totally appreciate the language about interfaith and whatever dialogue, in a way, I always think these things it's very important sometimes to be a bit more kind of transhistorical as well, and perhaps to give voice to traditions that may not be living traditions today, but may have something to contribute, and sometimes a part of the environment within which major contemporary world traditions were born, because that idea of cyclical rebirth is certainly a dialogue partner in some New Testament texts as it shapes its own apocalyptic thinking. So.
Yes, precisely. And I would say that because I spoke about this, it enabled you to say that just now. And I think this is the point. I'm wanting to use quite stark language because it then allows people to say, well, actually, we've got this way of thinking as well. But the dominant discourse does not involve what you've just said.
No, absolutely. I totally agree.
And it's that dominant discourse that I wish to try and challenge. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Earl, is the Katerina there?
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I realize that this is not exactly your topic, but maybe you could speak to it. Do you see anything going on in India that people, movements that pick up on this and provide us with models, actually sort of maybe in a more applied fashion that could be useful in the Western world? It's like, this morning we talked about sort of the Anglo-Protestant tradition. There's probably a particularly high rate of climate skepticism. Right. Is there something sort of concrete in India that could give us some hope? Because quite frankly, I'm looking for hope here.
Yes, great. So now I don't know enough about this, but why I was so pleased that these guests have come. Rachel was telling me, so they've actually got an NGO which works with the UN, and they have environmental programs. So Sylvia and Rachel, I think they're trying to bridge in the way that you're describing. So may I ask you to speak with them at the tea break, as they will know. Would you raise your hands? Yeah, Sylvia. Would that be okay? I just don't know enough about that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Oh, you've got somebody else? Yep, one more.
Thanks very much. Is this on? Doesn't seem as if. Okay, that's good. Very interested in learning about Eastern traditions and enriching our discourses. But my question is one that's generally about the links between discourse and practice, and it's really following, I think, what's been said here. In the Western Christian tradition, there's been a long talk about environmental stewardship, but it hasn't really made much difference to people's behaviours. And I've read that, for example, in certain Eastern religions, Buddhism, for example, with a more ameliorative attitude towards nature, it hasn't really made that much of a difference to actual practices. Have you got some examples of how practices have been changed through this discourse?
No, I think what you're describing is that we've gone into a global consciousness of acquisition. And because of that, so I very much enjoyed Rupert's reference to enoughism. Now, and another speaker I think was speaking about you've got examples of religious orders who will profess simplicity and so on. So what you get is certain peoples who observe a maybe more sustainable life. But perhaps that's always been the case. What this model provides is perhaps a framework as to why the dominant discourse doesn't do that, because it's a tragedy. It's always working its way towards an apocalypse. So it's not that the thought isn't there and the ideas are not there, but the dominance of the trajectory of this world always takes us towards this apocalyptic event, no matter how much we don't want it to be like that. So I would say that it's the discourse we need to encourage is this one of enoughism. I think some reaction towards the dominant discourse is the exploration of spirituality that many people have. And what they will be looking for is qualities of contentment. Oh, I feel peaceful. I feel content. Now, when they're saying that, what they're implying is that the way in which I've been living my life didn't provide that contentment or didn't provide that peace. I thought if I had 3 cars that went very quickly, I would be content. But it was never enough. And I think this is the crucial thing. So you go back to the spiritual thinking, which is ageless and timeless. But the actual practicality of it will require the broader discourse as we, as humanity, how much is enough for me?
Shailen, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.